Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks for being here. It is always a pleasure to be here, but if what just happened in the last 10 minutes back there is any indication, this is going to be a lot of fun tonight. We are going to be talking about three enormously different and enormously important first ladies, and they span a large part of this country's history in very different times for each of them. We're very excited and very proud to have these three first family representatives here. Kind of a unique club. There aren't a lot of them around, so to have them all here tonight is certainly a tribute to the foundation, to the library, and to the Ford family. We appreciate you bringing this here to Grand Rapids. Again, another excellent program, so thank you all for being here. I'm going to start with you, Margaret. Margaret Hoover, whose great-grandmother was Lou Henry Hoover, and Clifton Truman Daniel, whose grandmother was Bess Truman, and of course everybody knows that Susan's mom was Betty Ford. Each of them served in those unique and very interesting times. And I want to start with you, Margaret, because yours is the longest span between great-grandmother and yourself, yet you have a lot of interesting insights about a woman who served in what was a very difficult presidency.
She did indeed. Thank you first to Susan for inviting us here tonight. Thank you, Rick, for hosting, and the foundation for hosting us all here. It's really a privilege to be here in Grand Rapids and to see the museum and the library for the first time. We've done a little bit of this together in the past, Clifton, Susan and I. So forgive us, we may jest a little in between the three of us. But to Lou Henry Hoover, my great-grandmother, who I never knew, was born in 1874 in Waterloo, Iowa, was raised in California, and died in the Waldorf Astoria, where she lived with my great-grandfather in his post-presidency in 1944. She died 20 years before he died. And you're right, she was in the White House during a really difficult time, and her legacy as a first lady is little known, partly because her papers weren't opened until 1984, 20 years after Herbert Hoover's death. And she's lost a bit in the shadow of the Great Depression and Herbert Hoover's reputation as this was the worst economic calamity and the worst calamity that the country went through since the Civil War up to that point. And what I've learned about my great-grandmother and what I'm really passionate about is sharing her story and her legacy, because she was a pioneering woman, and I don't mean in the literal sense, but much like Bess was and much like Betty Ford was, she broke the molds of her time. And hopefully I'll have a chance to tell you a little bit more about how her time in the White House and how her time, because I don't want to go on and on and on, how her time in the White House and how her time, her life was such an extraordinarily, so hard to pigeonhole and stereotype. She, in many ways, I think, created a model that Eleanor Roosevelt then filled. And we think of Eleanor Roosevelt as an activist first lady, but Lou Henry Hoover absolutely was an activist first lady, doing things that had never been done before in the White House. And that was consistent with how she had lived her life up to that point, and then after the presidency as well.
I have to make a disclaimer here before we go to Clifton. The first president of the United States that I ever met was Gerald Ford. And I met him in 1976 at the Republican convention in Kansas City. The first president I ever saw was Harry Truman at his home in Independence. I grew up about 90 miles south of Independence, Missouri, and as a fellow Missourian, take great pride in Harry Truman. So I want you to tell me about perhaps one of the most reluctant first ladies that ever was, in Bess Truman.
Yeah, Margaret's talking about activist first ladies, and then you have my grandmother, the anti-activist first lady.
But we love Bess.
I love Bess too, but there's no getting around it. She was, first of all, when she got into the White House, the first thing she did was cancel Eleanor Roosevelt's weekly press conferences. She just wasn't going to do the same thing. Further, she issued a succinct biography, just a nice little short half-page biography. She wouldn't talk to anybody beyond that, and she requested that all press questions come to her after that in writing. And to each one of these questions, to almost every one of them, she replied, "No comment." So she, not quite the openness there. She said early on in my grandfather's career that she thought the role of a political wife was to sit next to her husband, keep quiet, and make sure her hat was on straight. That said, she didn't quite do that. My grandmother was very interested in my grandfather's career. She was very interested in politics. She was good at it. She understood it. She liked the game. I think she kind of liked being off to the side in the game so that she didn't actually have to participate, but she really enjoyed hearing what was going on in his life and helping him when she could. She wound up, I wrote a book last year with my grandmother's letters that she had written to my grandfather that my mother had not published when she was alive and then left them to me. And I think my mother did that to maintain my grandmother's privacy. But of course, I'm not my mother. I'm a rotten grandchild, and I didn't care.
And they're beautiful.
And they are beautiful letters. But you've got my grandmother reporting to my grandfather that she basically lied to politicians that wanted him to back them on the campaign. Just said, no, I'm sorry, he's not going to be home. He can't possibly do that for you. So she took part. She was engaged. She was a lot of fun as a First Lady, but again, compared to Lou and compared to Eleanor Roosevelt, a very much more behind-the-scenes First Lady who spent a lot of time, as I'm sure you all have heard, going back home to Missouri and leaving my grandfather alone in the White House. For good reason, taking care of her family, taking care of her mother, her brothers. She was very much a family-oriented First Lady, but my grandfather often said, in writing and in person, had it not been for my grandmother doing those things, holding down the fort, providing that sounding board, providing that stability, he could not have done the job that he did.
And unlike Mrs. Hoover, she lived longer than the president.
Yes, she outlived Grandpa by 10 years.
By 10 years.
Right. She is still the longest lived First Lady this country's had. She was 97 when she died. I hope those genes run in the family.
And she also died in Europe.
No, she died in Missouri.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, your mother was in New York. I'm sorry.
No, my mother was in Chicago.
But your mother lived in New York.
My family dies all over the place.
That's all our Key West conversations with the grandparent.
It is nice of them to share the wealth. Susan, many of us here, of course, are very familiar with your mom, but talk to us a little bit again about the person, because that person was developed well before they became First Lady, and how they performed in the office has a great deal to do from their early lives and how they were prepared, even if they didn't know they were preparing for that job.
Well, and that is true, but there are probably several people in this audience that could tell more things about my mother than I can tell about my mother, because some of you grew up with her and knew her as a young bride or high school or whatever. So Grand Rapids, as you all know, had a lot to do with my mother's character and molded her, I would say is the best way to put it. But I think my mother is kind of a cross between Bess Truman and Lou Hoover.
Yeah.
She was an activist when she wanted to be, and some of you have heard the story of she went to a palm reader years ago. This is, I think, way before she ever married my dad, or right after she had married my dad. And they said, you know, you will meet kings and queens. Well, to my mother, that meant she was going to dance, because of course we all know that dance was her love, and she danced with Martha Graham, that she would get to dance in front of kings and queens. Little did she know that she was actually going to meet them at state dinners and host kings and queens at the White House. So, but Mother, as you all know, was dance and the arts was so important to her. Her whole breast cancer, I mean, that was not something that she had planned for, but she took it and made it something so positive and was so determined to take a chance at changing women's health care, which she truly did. Luckily today, you know, the survival rate is now more than 90% from breast cancer, and when she was diagnosed, it was in the 70%. So she made a huge change in that, and her drug and alcohol. But she also was a very private person and wanted her private time, and there were many, many days that she would sit on the couch and go, I don't want to get dressed and go shake another hand or be that public persona, which is probably more the Bess Truman in her. But she loved it. She did a great job with it. And, you know, she only had 2.5 years. I think she would have been a fabulous First Lady for another chance at it. And who knows what she would have done with that. It would have been interesting to see where she would have gone with for another 4 years.
In both the case of your mother and your grandmother, this was unexpected, that they were thrust into the role of First Lady in very difficult circumstances. I mean, it's hard to overstate in the case of the death of Franklin Roosevelt, certainly the resignation of Richard Nixon, how it impacted the country. Did that put more pressure on them to be more forthcoming or show more strength, more resolve for the country? Was that part of the task that was laid on them in that unexpected moment?
Well, I think in Mother's situation, the country was in such unrest, and the American people didn't trust the presidency. This was a death situation, which is a little bit different. So in a sense, they're very different situations. Mother just kind of stepped in, and I think she kind of just slid in, went, I'm going to lay low and feel my feelers out and do it that sort of way. Bess's was a little bit different because the death is different.
Yeah, and I think my grandmother, while conscious of what she was stepping into, was also stubborn and wasn't going to let it change her. She was going to do her job, but she was not going to let it rule her. There's pictures. She knew what she was getting into in the 1944 Democratic Convention in Chicago when my grandfather was nominated to be on the ticket with President Roosevelt. Everybody was happy about that except my grandmother. And there are pictures of my mother and my grandfather waving and shaking hands and just, oh, everything's wrong. My grandmother's over there like this. Oh, damn it. Oh. You know, just knowing, it was a funny thing with President Roosevelt. Everybody knew how sick he was, but everybody denied how sick he was. So there was a whole, she knew, and she knew what was likely to happen, and that was just not something that she really wanted.
Well, and it's well to remember that this wasn't their first rodeo. They'd been in politics for a long time.
Yeah.
It was, you know, so she knew what this was like, and
Right.
just on the bigger stage. Margaret, talk to me a little bit about your great-grandmother. Now you're in the White House. Now you're the First Lady. From what you've been able to find, what was her impression of what her role was to be?
Well, she saw it as an enormous opportunity so a couple of things in terms of the role with the president. My great-grandfather was not a outwardly gregarious or publicly charismatic figure. He was orphaned when he was 9 years old. He had, and this fundamentally changes how you interface with the world. And she was a very gregarious, outgoing, engaging personality. So in many ways, she was the first lady to give public addresses on the radio. And I think she saw her role always with him as helping to soften him with his friends, in his work, and then finally in the presidency as well. So, but she also understood there was a role for the First Lady, and she I think was very cognizant of that. You see that throughout the letters. One of the things she did, and it wasn't replicated again until Jackie Kennedy came to office, is she was the First Lady to ever take a full and complete inventory of all of the furniture and the White House paintings and property, all of the things that were assembled in the White House from the time of George Washington onward, had never been cataloged or appraised or documented. And so she took this task on. This is one of the things she did. She was an academic in her own right. She had helped translate a book. This was one of her early accomplishments called De Re Metallica, which she was, by the way, the first woman to graduate with a degree in geology in the United States. She was in the 3rd class at Stanford. And by the way, a woman of the Victorian era who broke all the molds, went to school and studied really untraditional things, rocks, geology,
That's
mining.
not even fun now.
And so the Bible that they had, the Bible of mining was called De Re Metallica. It was this tome published in the 16th century all in Latin, and it had never been adequately translated. And she and my great-grandfather dedicated 5 years of their lives to translating this tome, having to collect all of these Latin books written at the same time to try to reconstruct the techniques that were used for mining in the 16th century, because words were made up, because they didn't actually know the Latin words for the specific techniques, and frankly, there probably weren't Latin words for some of these specific technologies in the 16th century when the Romans were around. So that they had to collect an entire library of books that ultimately ended up serving as one of the first, the basis of the Harvey Mudd's collection on geology. They just donated all the Harvey Mudd. So she was an academic in her own right, and those are the skills that she took to cataloging and inventorying all the furnishings of the White House, which then Jackie Kennedy took on when she created the White House Historical Association.
Side note, and you may not know this, but she was born in Illinois, is that right?
She was born in Waterloo,
Oh,
Iowa.
I'm sorry, in Iowa, and they ended up back in Iowa, but how did she get to California?
So her father had health problems in Iowa and moved to California for the climate when she was 5, 6, 7, quite young. So she was really raised in California, first in Whittier and then in Monterey Bay Peninsula. And so she grew up with pack mules. She had 2 daughters, and her father, wanted a son. And so he treated Lou like his son. So she loved the outdoors, actually got very involved in the Girl Scouts later on in her life, and spent probably 40 years, all the time when she returned to the United States until her death. The Girl Scouts was her primary sort of cause. And she said she'd been a scout her whole life because she grew up camping and she grew up spending the time in the outdoors, and wanted girls to, especially in the Victorian era and beyond, to get outside and to enjoy, to be more than ornamental.
Wasn't she good with a gun, too?
She did have a few pistols, and they're in the library in
Really
West
good
Branch,
shot,
Iowa.
though. But I mean,
She was
really accomplished.
she was a hunter. She was an equestrian. She was a marksman. She was a really dynamic.
You're going
very
to be president.
complex
It's good to
person.
have one of those.
Yeah.
You might need it.
I'll remind you, if you haven't, send up your questions, because obviously we'd like to hear them answer what you're interested in. But I want to ask the juxtaposition. Interesting in that time that you would move from Iowa to California. It's not as easy as it is today, whereas your grandmother was born, raised, and died in the same house, essentially, wasn't she? Wasn't that house in Independence the family home?
Born in a different house, yes.
But very nearby.
Her father, that was the house that we all know as the Truman home, was her grandfather's house originally.
Okay.
George Porterfield Gates built that house. Bought the house. The house dates back to the pre-Civil War, but it was a.
It's
it was
a
like
great
well, it was like
house,
one
so.
story, and then in 1885, George Porterfield Gates, who had made a pretty good living as a co-owner of the Queen of the Pantry Flour, the Wagoner Gates Milling Company. He was one of the wealthiest men in town. Just added all that big Victorian, basically built it up from what it was. She was born in her parents' house, which was nearby, but spent much of her life in the Gates house, in what became the Truman home. Her father committed suicide when she was 18 years old, and the family first went to Colorado for a year, the stigma being much worse in those days. Everybody left town for a year and then came back and moved in with her grandfather, and that's the house she called home for the rest of her life. So, 20 minus 97, 77 years in that house.
And that event really shaped, we've talked about this, it shaped
Yeah.
a lot of how Bess interacted with the press and the public because of the experience she went through when she was so young.
And my grandfather was very, very careful of her because of that, because he didn't want that coming out. It was very painful to her. Father, David Willick Wallace, was in many respects a wonderful guy. He was apparently his funeral in Independence was one of the biggest that the town had ever seen. He'd give you the shirt off his back. He was just a nice human being. He never had the career he wanted. He was a politician, a would-be politician, son of a former mayor of Independence. He never could seem to make headway, and he was never really a temperate man, and as things got worse, he was always in debt, borrowing money from his father-in-law, which was very hard for him. And as things got worse and worse, he drank more and more and more, and finally woke up one morning in 1903 and got dressed and went to the bathroom upstairs in the house and put a gun to his head. And nobody saw it coming. In those days, Madge Gates Wallace, his wife, dutiful wife of the time, did not question what condition he was in, where the money was coming from, what was going on. She nursed him through one hangover after another, and everybody was absolutely stunned when he killed himself. My grandmother was furious. She loved him dearly. He was her best friend, and he left without a word, without an explanation, and she was hurt by that the rest of her life. So that's where quite a lot of the privacy comes from.
That's an interesting insight. And then to move to Betty Ford and the almost diametrically opposed way that she dealt with some very personal, hurtful issues in her life, where Bess Truman and the president were
Right.
willing enough to
Hit it.
keep her pulled back. Of course, it was a different time, too. But by the 1970s, your mom broke the mold when it came to talking to the press. In fact, being a member, not covering at that point, but she may have given them more information than they knew what to do with from time to time.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you, and more information than I would have liked for some things. I mean, the whole breast cancer issue, I am so grateful that she opened up and was honest about that and what she has done to change women's health care. And just the fact that she didn't say, I'm having female problems. Well, the press wouldn't have, I mean, the press back then wouldn't have said, so tell us the truth. What's really going on? I mean, that's just, the press would not have done that then. She could have gotten away with saying female problems, but she also gave them details of that she had had a mastectomy, that there was how much lymph node involvement there was, and all of those things. The other side of it is when she did the Morley Safer interview, and she said, I wouldn't be surprised if my daughter had an affair. We could have left that, alone, because of the boys lined up at the gate going, oh, well, you got a hussy of a little daughter out there. So,
And as we were joking a couple of months ago, I think I was one of them.
well, Clifton and I are the same age, and so he was kind of lurking after me. So that's why I say there's
Presidential stalker.
Yeah. So, I mean, and I'm sure my brother Jack would have preferred mother not admitting that, her son had smoked dope and done all of those kinds of things. We're like, Mom, really? Do you have to share all of the details? Yeah. And we were criticized for wearing blue jeans. We were criticized for wearing fur coats, which would still be criticized today. What else were we? I mean, who knows? I mean, but, oh well, Betty chose to live her life on her sleeve, and thank goodness she did, because I think our country is a better place because it is. And it has set a wonderful example for other first ladies to follow, and has left the door open. So,
Margaret, we may not be as familiar with your great-grandmother as some more contemporary first ladies, but tell us something that would surprise us about her. And Jim, if you've got any questions, thank you, Jim.
Surprise.
I
He's
bet,
talking.
unless you study Lou Hoover, you don't know that she was the first lady ever to invite an African-American woman to tea. And it caused a tremendous scandal. It was called the DePriest incident. She was the wife of Congressman DePriest, who had been elected from Chicago, an African-American couple. And it was the tradition that first ladies always invited all the members of Congress's wives to tea. And they were Quakers. They were socially progressive in the context of their day on this issue. They knew it would be a scandal, or it could be a scandal, so they tried to handle it in the right way, but decided to go ahead with it because this would be a good move for the country. And it did create an outrage, and to make her feel better, my great-grandfather the next day invited her husband to the White House. And so this was the first time an African-American was invited to the White House publicly. Teddy Roosevelt had invited Booker T. Washington, but it was a secret meeting.
Interesting. What would surprise us? There are probably a lot of surprising facts about Bess Truman. What would surprise us the most?
Tell the bed
Go
slat
ahead.
story.
The what?
The bed slats. The
Yeah.
bug?
Oh, God.
Yes.
I've got
the
so many of
bug-
my favorite Bess Truman
the bug, the
stories.
bed
That's a
slats,
great
yeah.
Bess
I don't think they're
Well,
rolling now, so go
David
ahead.
McCullough got to that before I did. In fact, grandchildren
that's
don't even
true.
want to
You
know
have
these
your
stories,
own.
but it's
You have
okay.
your
No,
own.
it's a good story. My grandparents were very, very close and hated being apart. And my grandmother did leave him in the White House very often, left him in Blair House in the second administration. As I'm sure most of you know, the White House was rotten on the inside. That, by the way, is a reflection of its structure, not...
It's not a metaphor.
Thank you. They had to rebuild the whole thing, and they lived at Blair House for 3.5 years. My grandmother went back to Independence to care for her mother. There was always a tug of war. My grandmother was the rope, and my grandfather was at one end, and his mother-in-law was at the other end, and they were constantly pulling her back and forth. And so she went back to Independence. She was gone for a couple of months. And when she returned, the head usher, Mr. Fields, reported that it was just like sunshine breaking into Blair House. My grandparents were so thrilled to be with each other again that it just lit up the whole room. The staff everybody was walking on clouds, and it was just fantastic. And my grandmother came down the next day after her return, and she took Mr. Fields aside, and she said, "We have an issue upstairs. In the room, there's it's, oh, hell, Fields, one of the slats on the bed is broken. We have to..."
Do you know that
Like I
song?
said, grandchildren go, "Ugh, oh, God." So, but there's a surprise about Bess Truman.
Don't ask me that
All right.
question, because I can't top that one.
You're going to have to try. I mean, when... No,
I
I
am
mean,
in so
really,
much
I mean,
trouble.
this is a great opportunity.
No, there's a whole bunch of
Okay,
questions
all right.
right there.
This is a great question for all of you. Let me start here. It's addressed to everybody, I think. And it will be very different for each one of you, because it is, how did being a first family, first grandchild, great-grandchild, how does that affect you? I assume in varying degrees. Susan, you and I have talked about here on the stage before, but it surely does have an impact, even as it goes further down the family tree, obviously, with your mother and her career, and now with you and your career, and all of this does have an impact. How does it affect you, being one of the first?
Well, I guess it affects me differently in different ways. Of course, in Grand Rapids, I'm more recognized, more acknowledged, more people, they know me as Betty and Jerry's daughter. Most people don't even call me Bales, they call me Susan Ford, or Susan Ford Bales. But so here, and on the other side of that, to me, this is somewhat home, because this is where my cousins are, this is where my grandmother was, this is where my parents were raised. So this has more of a home feeling to it. At home in Tulsa, I am Waldo and Cecil Bales' daughter-in-law. My father-in-law, who just passed away recently, was city attorney, and so everyone goes, "Oh, so you belong to Waldo and Cecil." It's a really refreshing, nothing against it, it's just a very refreshing to be known for something else besides my own parents, and so proud of my in-laws. So I can hide when I want to hide, which is the nice part, and be dirty and grungy. And I mean, I go to the gym and nobody knows who I am at the gym, and I'm dirty and grungy just like everybody else. And then, you can get dressed up and put the contacts in and take the glasses off, and you play the other roles. So I guess that's the biggest thing. I can come and go in it as I please, and that's nice. I guess if I would not want to be a first daughter in today's society because of the 24/7 news cycle. It would be miserable. I think it would really be miserable. I don't know, I just assume.
Colton?
Just thinking, when she's talking about dirty and grungy, That's how we walked around Key West.
Just say, if you go to Key West,
You know, we were supposed to go for a photo op, and all of us, pull on grungy shorts and a T-shirt, hair's all sticking up because we went out the night before, and I thought I was the only one. I turned around, Susan walked in, and I went, "Oh, thank God."
I should point out, they did one of these recently in Key West. Surprisingly, I wasn't invited to that one.
Well, play
You
your
can come
cards
back
right,
here.
Rick.
I'll be
cards,
there.
maybe
I'll
we'll
be
get you
there.
there.
I'll be there.
I'm actually, no one is more surprised that I take such a role in my grandparents' legacy as I am. I had never intended to sit on the board of the Truman Library, I'm its honorary chairman. I work with the Little White House in Key West. I worked until recently for Truman College in Chicago. What happened? Everything has Truman on it. I had as a teenager, it was like, oh God, you have the chopped liver syndrome. Everybody comes up to you and says, oh, your grandfather was wonderful. What am I, chopped liver? You really, especially as a teenager, because you've got these people want to talk to you just because you are related to somebody more famous than you. So I went through I wanted to be famous too, so I thought I'd be an actor. That worked really well.
But you have a career in stand-up
You
comedy
do.
coming your way.
You should see him. He really is good.
on limited venues. But
Right, and the floor is like...
just presidential libraries. I got 13 gigs a year. But that I do this, that I take such a role, that I've written books about my grandparents, that I think what surprises me is that I'm really, really interested, and I really, really enjoy it. And I enjoy them as people, and I've come to enjoy the presidency through them and history through them. And it was something that I ran in the complete opposite direction from for years, and then it just caught up to me.
But none of your brothers have any
No.
interest either.
No.
You're the Lone Ranger.
No. Yeah. Well, my youngest brother, Thomas, when you prevail upon him to go to something, he's been to that event in Marshfield. He enjoyed it, but he doesn't. He's a computer programmer. He makes everything else run while I'm out front.
Yeah.
So, surprise, and happily so. But every once in a while I wake up and go, "Good God, what happened?"
I think there's no doubt about it that it's a very different experience. I mean, for first generation, second generation, and third generation, I agree with you. I think a lot of the Bush girls, Chelsea, I think the Obama girls are sheltered a little bit from it, which is nice. The press has stayed away, but you guys didn't have a choice in this matter. These were choices that your parents made long before you, and this was something that you patriotically did, and it involved a huge amount of sacrifice that was thrust upon you, and then you gracefully accepted. And I think my dad's experience resembles yours a little bit more, Clifton. At the time you get down to my generation, if you're involved at all, it's because it's a passion project, it's because you're interested, and it's because in my case, I think there's an incredible American story to tell about Herbert Hoover and Lou Hoover, and I'm frankly just interested in American history, and I love this country, and I think our story needs to be told. The American story needs to be told, and Lou Hoover and Herbert Hoover had such an incredible and unique journey through the American sort of tapestry that it's inspired me. A book that I wrote that came out last July was actually named after a book that my great-grandfather wrote in 1922, and I really believe that the ideas and the ideals that he espoused are extraordinarily relevant still to the way we see our politics today. It's called American individualism. But by the time you get down to me, Susan talks, I'm so delighted to hear Susan say, when she's in Tulsa, she can be Susan Ford Bales or Susan Ford or Susan Bales, and she can sort of choose. That's incredible, because I didn't even know that was possible for a child of a president. But certainly, by the time you get down to me, it's only sort of a matter of interest that a couple of us have expressed interest and are quite active, but it's a choice.
This is a great question. If you could ask your great-grandmother any question, what would it be?
I think I would ask her some girly stuff, just because that's the one thing she didn't write about and didn't get saved. So I
Okay,
would just be.
Quantify girly
But
stuff.
I mean, I think I want to know, like, what
Yeah, that
was it
could
like
be
to be a
anything.
woman
I don't
in this?
know.
What was it like to be a woman in London at the beginning of World War I? And she and my great-grandfather helped organize humanitarian relief for the Belgians and the Flemish and the citizens of northern France that fed 10 million Belgians a day for the course of the war. And she was intimately involved in helping him get that operation up and running. But she was a woman. And women really didn't run enterprises like that. And she was part of it. And they were in the same way that, that both of your relatives were. I think they had a partnership. But in the context of the time when women really didn't do some of the things that Lou was quite good at, I would be very curious to know sort of what it was like as a woman doing the things she did at the time she did.
Clifton, this is not one of the questions we got from the audience, but when I promised I would promised myself I would ask you tonight. And it's a story about your grandfather and your mother. Your mother, while your grandfather was in the White House, would occasionally perform publicly.
Occasionally.
And on one particular occasion, there is a story that I would like for you to shed some light on, to its veracity.
By perform, we should be clear, she's an incredible vocalist.
Right, I'm sorry.
She was a singer. She had an incredible voice.
I am,
Thank you, Margaret.
who would have thought she would have been the
This
one to go
trio
there?
is
I
getting
don't-
out of control here.
We've done this too
Sorry,
I
many
know,
times.
we've done this too much. Right, it was in Key West the last time. Performance
I
has
am
a whole
sorry
other.
I missed Key West. She was singing. A review-
Singing, thank you, yes.
A review was written that your grandfather didn't like.
That's right. The review, she was singing at Constitution Hall in 1950, and the review was written by Paul Hume of the Washington Post. And Mr. Hume said some unkind things about my mother's singing ability.
So, well, some very unkind things.
Well, yes. So, she's flat a good deal of the time was one of the phrases. My grandfather read that the next morning. The Korean War, I don't know if Korean War had started, but I can't say that. That would be very dramatic. But anyway, I do know that his oldest friend in the world, Charlie Ross, his press secretary, had died the morning of that concert at his desk of a massive heart attack. Grandpa was not in a good mood. And here comes this review. So he sat down and he wrote out a letter to Mr. Hume, about a page and a half, and said some very unkind things. And the end of the letter said, I would like to meet you in person someday. When I do, you will need steaks for black eyes, a new nose, and perhaps a supporter below. And he just sealed it up in an envelope, and he put a stamp on it, and he gave it to Mr. Fields and said, just stick that in an envelope, but stick that in a post office box on your way out. So it got past the PR people, who would have liked to have burned it. As an adjunct to that story, my mother always said that those letters, and the mail, the response mail ran 80-20 in Grandpa's favor after that. So he predicted that he was going to be backed up on this by fathers across the country. A few years ago, I gave a lecture at a retirement home in Evanston, Illinois. And during the question and answer period at the end of the night, a lady put her hand up. I was talking about this story. A lady put her hand up. And I said, yes, ma'am. And she said, you know, I used to accompany Paul Hume. And I'm a little slow, so I said, accompany him where? And she said, no. I used to play piano for him. And I said, whoa. You mean he sang? And she said, oh, yes. And I said, really? I have to ask. How was he? And she said, like a cow mooing. And I ran home and I called my mother and I told her. And I said, like a cow mooing. And there was dead silence on the other end of the line. My mother was laughing so hard she dropped the phone. So she got a little bit of it back. Mr. Hume, to his credit, was an excellent music critic. He had a wonderful, long, a fabulous career. He was a well-respected, wonderful man, tarnished for life by one bad letter.
Susan, this is a question for all of you and from someone in the audience. You touched on this briefly, But when you were talking about Chelsea, and when you were talking about the Bush daughters, and now with the Obamas, but in any circumstance, would any of you fathom living in the White House today? Given, I mean, the massive changes in the way the White House is covered. I mean, you as I said, you touched on it a minute ago, but it is kind of a fascinating question.
And I think everybody would understand it. It all depends how old you are. I was a senior in high school and a freshman in college. You really couldn't ask for kind of the worst time age-wise. I mean, that's a difficult time. I know there's lots of mothers out there who are trying to survive this age with their daughters. So to begin with, it's a difficult time. I think the Obama girls have done a fabulous job, and they've been very well protected. It's a little bit easier because of their age. You can protect them. I was driving cars and cutting loose and getting in trying to get out of trouble and not get caught getting in trouble would be a better way to put it. And being the fourth child, mother and dad were so tired by the time I came along that they just, well, I mean, it was one of these that I was dating a guy who went to Virginia Tech, and so I would go down to Virginia Tech on the weekends, and mother and dad assumed that I was safe and behaving.
And they assumed that because you had Secret Service protection. And
I had my girlfriends, Barbara and them with me.
Right.
I mean, we'd get a group of girls and we'd go down and we'd all share, one hotel room for the weekend. So my parents were assuming the Secret Service had me protected, nothing was going wrong, all of those things. And what they didn't realize is that's not the Secret Service's job to stop me from doing anything. It's just to protect me from anyone harming me. So let's put it
Unless it's Jim Beam, and then you're in,
Drinking age in Virginia was 21 then. But I was drinking. I will admit that. So I think it's an age issue, and I think that's the biggest way to handle it.
And something that Clifton, I mean, the criticism of your mother that came, her singing, I mean, this is something that I know you endured as well. And when you're a child or a daughter in the White House, I mean, you haven't volunteered for that service, but you are absolutely on the firing line for very ardent criticisms from the press that are blatantly unfair. I know you've in the past shared a few stories about that, but
yeah.
I know that that's just something that may be worse now. I don't know. You would be the one most qualified to answer that.
Well, I mean, it's one of those, and my mother said this, and I think First Ladies have continued this sense, is we did not choose to be here. Our family did not choose to be here. Leave my kids alone. Let them be kids. Let them grow up. When we were being criticized for blue jeans and driving fast cars and, Jack smoking dope and, what I mean, we were not perfect children. We were normal children trying to grow up, and I think that's the biggest thing that I look at it with the Obama girls. Leave them alone. They're just trying to be kids. Let them be kids, and they just happen to live in a really nice house, and their dad is a public servant. And that's, my dad had been in Congress for 25 years. I had grown up in Washington. I didn't have to change cities. My heart goes out to those girls. They've had to change schools. Lucy Johnson and I have had long talks about it because she was at National Cathedral and I was at Holton. But most of these kids come in and they have to change schools. They have to find new friends. I didn't have to do that. So every situation is a little bit different. And so it's just, I'm like, leave them alone. Just let them be kids and try and grow up.
But there is also the other side of the street. And when former President George W. Bush was here on the stage a few months ago, and he said to you that you two particularly were part of a very small club, being the children of the President of the United States, and how difficult it is as children or family members to hear people criticize your father or the President of the United States. President Bush said, paraphrasing, he didn't really care when he was in office, or at least he could take that. But he used to get furious when people would criticize his father. Did your mother ever talk to you about that? Was she, because all presidents get criticized.
Oh my God. The first story that pops into my head didn't have to do with criticism. During the 1948 campaign, Apparently the only 3 people in the country who believed my grandfather could win were him, my grandmother, and my mother. And George Thames, the New York Times photographer, was taking my mother's picture as she came out of the Hay Adams Hotel in Washington. And she's going to a car, and photographers being very courtly in those days, he's backing up and taking pictures. And then when she got close enough to the car door, he held the car door open for her as she got into the limousine. And as she got in, he said to her through the window, "Geez, Miss Truman, it doesn't look real good for your dad." And Mom grabbed the door out of his hands, leaned through the window and said, "You have no faith," and slammed the door and took off. So, you know, there you go.
I mean, I can say, having witnessed from previous generations, being related to the guy who was most vilified in the 20th century in terms of the president who was most vilified, that pain and that criticism is really hurtful, and it is intergenerational. To the sense that because the kids didn't ask to be in the White House, the kids didn't ask for that life, but they take on that pain. When their parents get criticized, they internalize that. And it can shape an entire family's perspective for multiple generations. And I have to say, I certainly saw that in my grandmother, in my grandfather, in my dad. And frankly, you know, in my own way, I sort of took on a defensive nature about my great-grandfather early on, just because that was the posture of the Hoovers. I mean, we were defensive about Hoover because we wanted to prove that there's this whole other side of him that the country didn't know, and that maybe the Great Depression wasn't all his fault, which fortunately, you know, economic history and historians are beginning to the narrative is beginning to change, and I think be more accurate. But it, you know, I think that pain is a pain that. I mean, you guys can attest to it more, but I've certainly seen it in the levels in my family.
Well, and that's one of the reasons that Margaret and I are friends, because my grandfather and her great-grandfather were such good friends, because my grandfather knew that President Hoover had not started or perpetuated the
Harry
Depression.
Truman reached out to Herbert Hoover within 5 days of becoming president and invited him back into public service. And Herbert Hoover and Harry Truman were friends for 20 years, and Herbert Hoover never forgot Harry Truman. I mean, he absolutely loved him, and their friendship was real, and it was long, and it was enduring, and the first time we got together and talked was about that friendship.
Right.
And so it was it was because Harry Truman breached that partisan divide.
And of course, he had to invite him back into the White House by writing one of those surreptitious letters and sticking it in the mailbox.
To Mr. Fields. Oh no, Mr. Fields shut it down.
Right. Mr. Fields must have taken more important correspondence to the damn mailbox.
Mr. Fields knows way more
Yeah.
than we all
Mr.
know.
Fields, I believe, has actually written a book. I have to go get a copy.
We are unfortunately running rapidly out of time. Try, if you can, and Margaret, again, I'm going to start with you, move back this way. The White House years are over. In the case of President Truman, he didn't run again. In the case of your family, ran and lost in '76. And obviously, for the Hoover family, it was a big disappointment leaving that White House. What was it like for your great-grandmother?
They immediately went back to a house that she had built on Stanford University's campus, which is now inhabited by the president of Stanford. She had built the house, designed the house. She wanted to be outdoors and in the West. She loved the West. Herbert Hoover didn't want to be that far away from the action. So finally they settled on New York after a couple of years, and she went back to the Girl Scouts and became president again of the Girl Scouts of America. She had been the president in the 20s. She had been the one who had gotten Mrs. Wilson to be the first chair, honorary chair lady of the Girl Scouts of America. So every first lady since then has been the honorary chair of the Girl Scouts of America. And Lou Henry Hoover had been president in the 20s, so she went back. She was president again in the 30s, and spent a lot of her time devoting herself to charitable service and to sort of organizations. The Salvation Army and the Girl Scouts were her big ones. And when she died suddenly of a heart attack in New York in 1944 at St. Bartholomew's Church Cathedral, where they had her funeral, the first 3 rows were filled with Girl Scouts in uniform, reserved for Girl Scouts in uniform. So.
Bess Truman was none too unhappy to be away from Washington, was she, when it was all that?
Oddly, the opposite is true. When it came time to retire, she wanted to stay in D.C. And my grandfather said, no, hell no, there's nothing worse than an ex-president hanging around Washington. So they went, they loved the Senate years. My grandmother she liked her friends, she liked the social life. She wanted to just back off from the White House and go back, and she really enjoyed Washington, which surprised me too. She went back to Independence, went back to her friends, went back to her clubs, went back to to community work and all of that, and into retirement. The one thing that surprised her, my grandfather spent the first, let's see, he retired in 1953. The Truman Library was dedicated in 57. For those 4 years, he was raising money, building the library, had an office in downtown Kansas City. He was gone for their whole married life. He'd been gone a lot of the day, never came home in the middle of the day, worked obnoxious hours. Somebody once asked my grandfather, what do you do to relax? He said, work. So he was gone all the time, and the Truman Library was dedicated, and he moved into his new office in the Truman Library and realized it was only a mile from his house and walked home that day for lunch, walked in the door. My grandmother went, good God, what are you doing here? He said, I thought I'd come home for lunch. She said, don't do that. And he never did again.
Although his walks were legendary in Independence, he would take this morning constitutionals. We have a lot better, most of us here have a much better knowledge of what it was like after the White House for your mom. She stayed very busy for a very long time.
Well, she did stay busy, and it was one of those things that she continued her breast cancer work, which was so important to her, and then she got involved and started the Betty Ford Center, which was 5 minutes away from the house, so she spent a lot of time there for 20 some odd years working with patients. But her, she continued to speak, she continued, at that point, they hadn't even built the Palm Springs house, so they built the Palm Springs house, and she spent a lot of time alone while he traveled. Kind of a similar deal. If he came home for lunch, it was a shock. So she was a very busy woman and was very busy until the end.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. I want to thank the Ford Foundation, the library. I want to thank the Ford family, as always, for including me in this. Margaret, thank you. Clifton, Susan, what a great panel. I can't wait till we go to Key West.